In the summer of 1588, one of the largest expeditionary fleets yet assembled in the Atlantic left the coast of Portugal and turned north. Around 130 ships, roughly 27,000 men, soldiers, sailors, surgeons, priests, galleons towering 4 and 5 stories above the waterline, armed with over 2,000 cannons. The fleet stretched for miles across the open Atlantic, moving in a tight defensive crescent. Its formation designed to be impenetrable. Its destination, England. Its mission, to cross the English Channel, rendezvous with a waiting army in the Spanish Netherlands, ferry those troops across the English coast, march on London, depose Queen Elizabeth I, and return England, by force if necessary, to the Catholic faith. The man who ordered it was Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch on earth. The man who blessed it was Pope Sixtus V, who promised a crusading indulgence to every man who sailed. The fleet carried with it a papal banner, and in the minds of those who sent it, something close to the will of God. What happened next would take 3 months, claim the lives of more than 15,000 men, and help determine the shape of the modern world. This is our episode on the most consequential battles in history. I am Benito and welcome to the Jack Historian. Today we will discuss the Spanish Armada. To understand why the Armada was sent, you have to understand the world it sailed into. A world that had been fracturing along religious lines for most of the previous century. If we go back to 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed these grievances against the Catholic Church to a door in Wittenberg. His objections centered on the sale of indulgences, but extended to papal authority, clerical corruption, and the gap between church doctrine and scripture. What began as a theological dispute became a revolution. Within a generation, the religious unity of Christendom that had held, however imperfectly, for 1,000 years had shattered across Northern Europe. By the mid-1500s, Germany was divided. Scandinavia was Lutheran, Switzerland was Calvinist, and England had broken from Rome entirely. The English break at first had nothing to do with doctrine. It stemmed from a king who wanted an annulment he couldn't get. Henry VIII had come to the throne in 1509 as everything a Renaissance king was supposed to be: young, athletic, educated, politically shrewd. He hadn't expected to rule. His older brother Arthur was the real heir, and when Arthur died young, Henry inherited both the crown and Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. The marriage functioned well for years. What Catherine could not do, despite repeated pregnancies, was produce a surviving male heir. Of 6 children, only 1 daughter, Mary, lived past infancy, in an age when secure succession was everything. This was a dynastic crisis. By the late 1520s, Henry had also fallen decisively in love with Anne Boleyn, who refused to become his mistress. She would be queen or nothing. Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start. Marrying his brother's widow violated church law, he argued, and the papal dispensation allowing it was therefore nullified. What he wanted was not a divorce, but an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never legally existed. The obstacle was Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, whose troops had sacked Rome in 1527 and who effectively held the Pope as his prisoner. Pope Clement VII was not in a position to humiliate the emperor's family, whatever the theological merits of Henry's case. Henry's solution was to remove England from papal jurisdiction entirely. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared him supreme head of the Church of England. He got his annulment from his own Archbishop of Canterbury, married Anne Boleyn, and the rupture with Rome was complete. The irony is considerable. The Protestant England that the Armada aimed to destroy existed because one king could not secure an annulment through ordinary channels. And the queen who faced that armada was Anne Boleyn's own daughter, the child born from the union that had set the whole break in motion. Philip II of Spain regarded himself as the ruler divinely appointed to address the emergency the Reformation had created. By 1588, Philip's Spain stood as the dominant power on earth. Silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico poured into the treasury in quantities that staggered contemporaries. Spain controlled much of Italy, the Low Countries, Portugal, and the Philippines. Its infantry, the famous tercios, were considered the finest soldiers in the world. Philip was the heir of Charles V, who had dreamed a unified Christian Europe under Habsburg rule. Philip shared that dream and had the resources to pursue it. He was genuinely devout, not a ruler cynically wielding religion as a cover, but a man who sincerely believed that God had entrusted him with Spain's wealth and power for a sacred purpose. He spent hours daily in prayer and governed from the Escorial Palace outside Madrid, with meticulous personal attention. He trusted almost no one to filter or summarize what reached him, preferring to read every significant dispatch himself and annotate responses directly in the margins. It was the governing style of a man convinced if he did not read it himself, it would not be done correctly. England remained the problem he could not resolve through diplomacy or patience. Elizabeth I had come to the throne in 1558 and quickly restored the Protestant Church of England that her Catholic sister Mary had tried to dismantle. Philip had known Elizabeth for years. He had been briefly married to her sister and had initially sought a working relationship. But that eroded steadily. England was sheltering and financing Protestant rebels in the Dutch Netherlands. English privateers operating with tacit royal backing were raiding Spanish treasure fleets in the Atlantic. And in 1587, Elizabeth had ordered the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic claimant to the English throne, removing the last avenue through which Philip might have installed a sympathetic monarch in London without outright conquest. That decision exhausted whatever remained of his patience. Mary's death altered his calculations sharply. While she lived, an invasion could be framed as restoring a legitimate Catholic queen to her rightful throne. With her gone, her heir, James VI of Scotland, was Protestant and showed no inclination to convert. If Philip wanted a Catholic England now, he would have to manufacture one from scratch, conquest and occupation rather than regime change. It was a considerably heavier undertaking, and he knew it. He proceeded anyways. The planning reflected his character. Philip immersed himself in every detail of the enterprise of England. Shipbuilding, supplies, commanders, routes, timing, coordination with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, all managed through his own desk. Across the Channel, England had been watching Spanish preparations for months. By early 1588, no one doubted the fleet was coming. The only question was whether England would be ready when it arrived. Elizabeth's England was modest by contemporary standards, perhaps 4 million people, against Spain's roughly 8 million. Its treasury was limited, its standing army small. But he had a capable navy, a deep tradition of seamanship, and a queen who understood that her survival and her country's were inseparable. Her naval commanders Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Lord Howard of Effingham were among the most experienced sailors of the era, many of them hardened by years of privateering against the very empire they now faced directly. With the stage now set in both courts, let's turn to the fleet itself and why its design carried the seeds of its own undoing. The armada that eventually sailed was genuinely impressive and genuinely flawed in ways that would prove decisive. Its commander was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and he had not wanted the job. When Philip appointed him, he wrote back with unusual candor for a man of his rank, confessing that he had no experience of war at sea, that he suffered from seasickness, and that he considered himself unsuited for the role. Philip appointed him anyway. What he needed was not a fighting admiral, but an administrator capable of managing a logistics operation of staggering complexity, and Medina Sidonia was exactly that. What the campaign would also demand was naval judgment under fire, and there his lack of experience would show. That said, the composure with which he managed an increasingly desperate situation earned him more credit from later historians than older English accounts, eager to mock the man sent against Drake, were willing to give. The strategic plan itself contained a flaw that no commander could entirely overcome. Philip's design required the armada to sail north to the Flemish coast, where the Duke of Parma, Spain's finest general, with 30,000 veteran troops at his disposal, was waiting to embark and cross to England. It was an amphibious operation of enormous ambition, and it depended on two forces coordinating precisely across a distance they had no reliable means of communicating across. The obstacle was the Dutch flyboats. The shallow waters of Flanders were controlled by Dutch rebel vessels, small, nimble, shallow-drafted ships that would operate where the Armada's heavy galleons could not follow. Parma's troops would have to cross open water, fully exposed, without harbor protection. Parma itself had been warning for months that this was close to impossible. Philip from Madrid did not change the plan. The two fleets also approached naval combat from fundamentally different premises. Spanish doctrine treated gunnery as a preparatory act, a close-range volley to disorder the enemy's deck before the real work began, which was boarding. The Spanish were not poorly armed. They carried heavy guns and knew how to use them. But in their tactical sequence, the guns were there to set up the infantry action, which was considered the decisive moment. Their ships were tall, heavy, and packed with soldiers precisely because of it. The English had been moving in a different direction for years. Echoing the massive basilica cannon that shattered Constantinople's walls in 1453, as we covered in the last episode, naval artillery had evolved dramatically by the late 1500s. Early ship guns were often heavy, short-range bombers or Perriers, used merely as a one-shot prelude to boarding. But over the 16th century, improvements in casting and powder produced lighter, longer-barreled bronze and iron cannons, especially culverins and demi-culverins, with far greater range and reload speed. The English embraced this fully. Their race-built galleons were lower, faster, and harder to catch, with stable lower platforms and four-wheel carriages that enable sustained broadsides at distance. Their doctrine evolved toward gunnery not as a prelude to boarding, but as a substitute for it. The practical effect was straightforward. English speed and long-range cannon denied the Spanish the ability to close. And without closing, there was no boarding. And without boarding, the thousands of soldiers packed into those tall galleons were essentially cargo. Both fleets carried substantial ammunition at departure. The difference was that English gunnery tactics sustained fire at range over hours and days, consumed shot far faster than the Spanish had planned for in a campaign of this length. As the fighting extended across a week of channel engagements, the imbalance would matter. Howard's fleet had its own difficulties. It was a mixed force of royal warships and armed merchantmen, uneven in quality and firepower. Supply was a constant struggle. Elizabeth's government had a well-established habit of releasing money only when the danger could no longer be denied. And Drake, the most experienced and aggressive commander in the fleet, was serving as vice admiral under Howard, a nobleman whose value was as much political as military, but who had the good sense to defer to the men who knew the sea. What both sides shared as the fleets moved toward each other was an acute understanding of what was at stake. For Spain, the Armada carried the aspirations of the Counter-Reformation. For England, the threat of national extinction. On the eve of the campaign, as the Armada was sighted off the Lizard, Howard wrote to Walsingham that the English fleet was ready and would engage the enemy. But he also described the Spanish force as wonderful, great, and strong, and said that they would pluck their feathers little and little. Those words relayed to the Queen showed resolve tempered by a realistic view of the odds they faced. Now, with the pieces on the board and the fleets ready, the campaign begins, and the first blows fall not from cannon, but from the weather itself. The Armada initially left Lisbon on May 28, 1588, but storms scattered it almost immediately, forcing a return to port and major repairs. After weeks in Corunna for resupply and refitting, the fleet finally set sail again on July 21st and 22nd, heading north across the Bay of Biscay. It was sighted off the Lizard, the southwestern tip of Cornwall, by an English scout vessel on July 19. The signal fires the English had prepared along the coast were lit one by one, carrying the news inland faster than any rider could. Within hours, it had reached Plymouth, where Howard and Drake's fleet were waiting. There is a story, almost certainly invented but persistent enough to have earned its place in the folklore, that Drake was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe, where the news arrived and insisted, "We still have time to finish the game and to thrash the Spaniards too." True or not, it captures the image England wanted of itself in that moment: relax, derisive of the Spanish power, and in no particular hurry. Reality appeared less theatrical. Getting the fleet out of Plymouth Harbor against a strong southwest wind required a difficult process called warping, rowing anchors out of ahead of the ships and hauling against them by brute effort. It took most of the night. But when the English fleet reached open water in the Channel on July the 20th, they had positioned themselves upwind, the windward side of the Armada. The weather gauge, the upwind position, was the single most important tactical advantage in the age of sailing warships. With the wind behind you, you could choose when to close for battle, bear down on the enemy at speed, and then hold back upwind to break off whenever you wished. The English secured it right from the outset and held it for most of the campaign. What followed was a week of fighting as the fleets moved up the English Channel. Despite the drama, the battles remained largely inconclusive. The Armada maintained its tight crescent formation with impressive discipline. The wings curved back to shield the slower supply and transport ships in the center, leaving no obvious weak points for attack. The English stayed close but out of reach. They harried the Armada from the rear and flanks, firing long-range cannon shots that caused steady damage but never broke the formation apart. There were sharp, prolonged clashes off Portland Bill and the Isle of Wight. Fierce exchanges that cost both sides ships and men. Yet, every time the Spanish tried to close the distance for boarding, the English simply pulled away. They kept the range where their longer guns were effective, while the Spanish soldiers packed aboard for hand-to-hand fighting could do nothing. No single battle delivered a knockout blow. 2 Spanish ships were lost in the first days, one to a gunpowder explosion, one to a collision, and Drake characteristically broke off pursuit in the night to capture the damaged galleass Rosario and claim the prize for himself. Howard was furious. Drake was unapologetic. It was a small incident, but a revealing one, capturing the tension that ran through the English command between strategic discipline and the habits of privateering that had made men like Drake rich. By August 6, the Armada had reached Calais roads, just off the French coast, and anchored. Parma's army was a matter of miles away, but Parma could not move. The Dutch flyboats were watching the Flemish shallows, and there was no way to embark 30,000 men in open water under their guns. The operation was stalled, and Medina Sidonia had no good options. Howard called a council of war. The conclusion his commanders reached was the same one the situation demanded. The anchorage had to be broken, the formation scattered, the Armada forced into the kind of disorganized engagements where the English could do real damage. They would use fireships. 8 vessels were prepared overnight on August 7th. They were loaded with pitch, tar, gunpowder, and cannons with charges set to explode in the heat. These fireships were sent downwind toward the anchored Spanish fleet. Their skeleton crews lit the fires and rowed hard for safety as the ships ignited. The Spanish had expected fireships and positions pinnaces, nimble supporting boats, to intercept and tow them away. But the blazes grew fiercer than anticipated. When the loaded guns began firing wildly in the flames, panic spread among the captains. Ships cut their anchor cables and fled into the darkness, losing formation and, crucially, their anchors. Without anchors, they could not re-anchor precisely at dawn. By morning, the Great Crescent that had held firm through a week of channel fighting was broken and gone. Howard saw this chance and seized it. The stage was now set for the campaign's only true fleet battle. The Battle of Gravelines was fought on August 8, 1588, off the Flemish coast, and it was the only full-scale close-range fleet battle of the entire campaign. With the Armada scattered and disorganized after the fireship panic, Howard's fleet pressed in closer than he had dared before. For hours, the English worked their guns in sustained rotation, the kind of continuous gunnery at shortening range that the Spanish, without the speed to close and board, and with their ammunition depleting faster than anticipated, could not effectively answer. The fighting was the most intense of the campaign, and the damage showed it. Several Spanish ships were sunk outright and captured or driven into the Flemish shoals. Others were left barely afloat. Medina Sidonia's own flagship, the Portuguese galleon San Martin, absorbed more than 200 shots before the day was done and came close to going down with all hands. The Santa Ana, the San Felipe, the San Mateo, all critically damaged, some beyond saving. And then English ammunition ran critically low. Howard had not exhausted his shot entirely, but he had expended enough that sustaining the engagement at the intensity Gravelines demanded was no longer a reasonable calculation. He eased off. It is one of the stranger facts of the campaign that the battle ended not with a decisive Spanish collapse, but with an English supply limit. The Armada, battered and driven north, but not destroyed, still a fleet, still nominally capable of regrouping if circumstances allowed. They did not allow it. Medina Sidonia took stock of what remained to him. The weather gauge was gone. The winds that had pushed him north made beating back south against them effectively impossible. His anchors had been cut in the fire ship panic and could not be replaced at sea. His ships were damaged, his men weakened by days of fighting, short on food and shorter on water. The rendezvous with Parma, the entire strategic purpose of the campaign, was now beyond reach. He made the only decision the situation allowed. The Armada would sail north, round the top of Scotland, curve down past Ireland, and come home the long way. What followed was not a military defeat in any conventional sense, it was something in many ways worse, a prolonged retreat across some of the most dangerous waters in the world, with damaged ships, exhausted crews, no safe harbor available, and the North Atlantic autumn coming on. The voyage home was where the Armada truly died. Medina Sidonia issued careful instructions before the fleet turned north. See room to keep from the coasts, depths, and currents to avoid. For a healthy fleet with intact rigging and anchors, the route was dangerous but navigable. The Armada had none of that. The gales of Scotland and Ireland were typical North Atlantic autumn weather, fierce westerlies that those waters produce every year. But the ships already battered and leaking from Gravelines, crewed by men ravaged by dysentery and scurvy, starving and parched, could not endure what a sound fleet might have ridden out. One by one, then in groups, they drove onto the rocks. The shore collected them over weeks, great galleons grinding onto reefs in the darkness, men drowning in the surf, survivors dragging themselves onto beaches, exhausted and in many cases already dying. It is worth pausing on what those men had endured before they even reached the water. Weeks at sea in deteriorating ships, watching the campaign unravel around them, knowing the way home was the long way, with nothing left in reserve. By the time they reached the Irish coast, many were already beyond saving, regardless of what they found ashore. English authorities had issued explicit orders that shipwrecked Spaniards were to receive no assistance. Where English garrisons had reached, survivors were executed. Some local Irish chieftains, calculating what English rule meant for those who defied it, did the same. Others sheltered these strangers, fed them, and passed them quietly northward towards Scotland. Acts of humanity that the official record largely ignored. One ship concentrates the scale of the disaster into a single image. The Girona was a galleass that had taken on the survivors of several other wrecked vessels, carrying well over 1,000 men, far beyond anything she was built to hold. She went onto rocks near the Giant's Causeway on the North Antrim coast. Of everyone aboard, perhaps 9 or 10 men survived. The rest went down with her or were killed on the shore. The survivors reached Spain in ones and twos through October, their ships straggling into Santander with other northern ports over weeks. When the counting was done, roughly 60 to 67 ships had returned of the around 130s that sailed. Between 15 and 17,000 men were dead, the majority not killed by English cannon but by storm, the sea's exposure, and the slow attrition of the long retreat. Philip received the news at the Escorial. His response, recorded by those around him, was composed to the point of severity. He had sent his fleet to fight against men, he said, not against the winds and the waves of God. He returned to his papers. He would order 2 or more armadas in the years that followed. Neither would come close to what the first had attempted. In England, the mood was something close to exultation. Elizabeth had delivered the speech to the troops assembled at Tilbury before the outcome was known, expecting an invasion that ultimately never came ashore. She told them she had the heart and stomach of a king, and a King of England too. The words did exactly what a great rhetoric is supposed to do. They fixed the moment and made it permanent. Carpe diem. The image of Elizabeth defiant on the eve of invasion would serve her legend for the rest of her reign and long after her death. The commemorative medal struck to mark the victory carried a Latin inscription, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt. God blew and they were scattered. It was a convenient theology, crediting providence rather than seamanship, storm rather than strategy, but it captured what England needed to believe about what had happened in the summer of 1588. And belief, in the end, has its own kind of historical consequence. The consequences of the Armada's failure unfolded over generations, but three stand out as truly decisive. The most immediate was the survival of Protestant England, and through it, Protestant Northern Europe. In 1588, the Reformation still hung in the balance. The Dutch revolt against Spain remained unresolved, and the 30 Years' War lay 3 decades in the future. Had England fallen, the Dutch resistance would almost certainly have collapsed without English support, money, and safe havens. Philip's dream of Catholic reconquest would have gained real momentum. The fact that England endured locked in a Protestant North that would shape the politics, commerce, and culture of the coming centuries. The second consequence played out across the Atlantic. 96 years earlier, Columbus had crossed the ocean. In the century that followed, Spain turned the Atlantic into its private highway, hauling silver from the Americas in volumes the medieval world could scarcely comprehend. Spain asserted exclusive rights to the New World and in 1588 possessed the naval and military power to back their claim. The Armada's defeat changed the equation. England emerged emboldened to challenge Spanish dominance at sea, and the Dutch reached the same conclusion. Within a single generation, English and Dutch merchants, sailors, and colonists were trading, settling, and raiding across the Atlantic and beyond in ways Spain could no longer stop. The monopoly Columbus had opened, the Armada helped crack wide. The third and last consequence was quieter at the time, yet perhaps the most enduring. At its heart, Philip's enterprise of England was a medieval undertaking, a crusade blessed by the Pope, built on the conviction that religious duty could override the sovereignty of another state. The failure did not erase that idea overnight, but it struck a blow from which she never fully recovered. The emerging concept of state sovereignty, the principle that what happens within a nation's border is that nation's business, was put to the test in the summer of 1588 and held firm. Much of the modern world that follows in the series rests on that survival. But if we go into our hypothetical of the road not taken, what if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? The longer you consider the question, the more intriguing it becomes, because success was never as far-fetched as the final outcome suggests. The fireship attack that shattered the Armada's anchorage at Calais succeeded largely through panic. The Spanish had anticipated the threat and stationed pinnaces to intercept and tow the blazing vessels away, yet when the fires burned hotter than expected and the loaded guns began exploding chaotically, their captains lost nerve. A calmer response that night, and the fleet holds position. The crescent stays intact. The strategic picture at dawn looks entirely different. Even so, the Duke of Parma still confronted an intractable problem in the Flemish Shallows. The Dutch flyboats, his 30,000 veterans, would have to embark in open water, aboard flat-bottomed barges directly under the guns of nimble, shallow draft rebel vessels that the Armada's heavy galleons could not reach or suppress. Parma himself regarded the operation as close to impossible, and he was not a man prone to needless pessimism. A successful invasion, therefore, hinged on two unlikely events aligning perfectly: the the fireships neutralized, and the flyboat barrier somehow overcome. That combination makes outright success considerably less probable than the fireship moment alone might imply, but not impossible. If both had gone right, the landing force would have been formidable. 30,000 battle-hardened infantry led by Europe's finest general, facing an English land army that was, by comparison, inexperienced, thinly spread, and untested in large-scale action. London lay only 70 miles from the Kent coast. Whether Elizabeth could have rallied effective resistance remains genuinely uncertain. Catholic nobles in England included some who quietly favored a Spanish outcome. Loyalty to the Queen was deep, but not absolute. Any powerful landing would have tested it in ways we cannot predict with confidence. A successful conquest, and conquest is the accurate term, since Spain could never have ruled England without prolonged occupation, would have created immediate and severe problems of its own. The Spanish Empire was already overstretched financially across 4 continents. Holding down a hostile Protestant population of 4 million with inevitable resistance and guerrilla warfare would have demanded resources Madrid could not sustain indefinitely. The occupation might have lasted only a few years by historical standards, yet even a brief conquest leaves lasting scars, disrupted institutions, fractured society, and entire paths of development forever closed. The most profound of those closed futures concerns the Dutch. An England under Spanish control would have severed the vital lifeline, money, men, safe harbors that sustained the revolt in the northern Netherlands. Without it, the Protestant cause in the Low Countries would almost certainly have collapsed, and the Reformation across Northern Europe would have been thrown onto the defensive at the very moment it most needed consolidation. The world that emerged, the world of nation-states, Atlantic commerce, and Protestant political culture would look fundamentally different. The storms that wrecked so many ships off Ireland were never a military outcome. They were simply weather, indifferent to theology, unmoved by a papal blessing, careless of human plans. One of the sobering truths of the Armada campaign is that the decisive moments were often settled not by seamanship, strategy, or the quality of commanders, but by autumn gales in the North Atlantic that would have blown just as fiercely no matter who sailed through them. At its most consequential, history can be that random and arbitrary. In closing, the Armada that sailed from Lisbon in the spring of 1588 represented the last serious effort by a single Catholic power to reverse the Reformation in Northern Europe to direct military conquest, to settle by force what theology and diplomacy had failed to resolve. What remained of it limped home in the autumn, having failed at every stage of its mission. England did not prevail because it was materially stronger. By most measures, it was not. The Armada failed because of tactical miscalculations, a strategic plan that never aligned with operational realities, a commander lacking the naval experience the campaign required, a weather system utterly indifferent to the ambitions of the Counter-Reformation, and an English fleet that fought with discipline and skill exactly when it mattered most. In the next episode, we move 95 years forward to Vienna, 1683. The Ottoman Empire launches its final massive thrust into the heart of Europe. A Polish king commands the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, and the fate of a continent hangs on a single afternoon on a hillside outside an Austrian city. I will see you on the battlefield. Bye.